by adults. Another remarkable similarity is that birdsong, much more than primate communication, is organized according to a hierarchical set of rules. Researchers have described the individual notes of a song as syllables, which combine to create systematic motifs. And these motifs build in structured ways to create novel songs. Many birdsong experts have argued that this is analogous to phonemes combining into words and words combining into novel sentences in human language. Many people are surprised that birds generate novel structures based on rules. But it still stops short of being generative in the same way language is. The key to true generativity is that a communicator must be able to use the rules of a language to create different meanings. Meaning is the key. With birdsong, it's possible to create infinite novel combinations, but there's no evidence that those combinations actually mean anything in the way that different sentences mean different things. So although there are some key elements shared between human language and non-human communication in the wild, there's some big differences. What if we took a more direct approach? What if humans tried to teach language to other animals? Might some of the differences disappear? Let's start first with the countless natural experiments tried with humans' best friend, dogs. It's clear that dogs can learn some basic words. Sit, heel, and stay are standard vocabulary for dogs around the world. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. There are many cases of dogs that have a vocabulary of dozens or even hundreds of words. The most famous and impressive example is Chaser, a border collie trained by the Wofford College psychology professor John Pilley. Chaser was said to know over 1,000 words for commands, toys, and objects, which is comparable to a typical 3-year-old, human 3-year-old. Even more impressive, this learning took place over only 3 years, and there's also evidence that Chaser could handle strings of words. For example, she could understand the difference between take ball and take ball to frisbee. One key difference between a word-learning dog and a typical 3-year-old is the inferences they make when learning new words. As we'll discuss in a few lectures, when a child learns a word, they implicitly categorize those words based on certain features, most prominently the shape of an object. But things are less clear with dogs. Emil van der Zee at the University of Lincoln in the UK did a set of controlled experiments on a different border collie named Gable and found a different type of categorization, size of object. And even that was not stable from one learning trial to the next. So compared to dogs, humans seem to have very specific and consistent cognitive heuristics that guide their early word learning, suggesting that they start with some quite distinct cognitive machinery. What about other species? We've covered land and air, so let's go to the sea. Let's talk about dolphins, our underwater mammal relatives. Dolphins naturally communicate by whistling, which some believe has symbolic properties. For example, dolphins seem to have distinct whistles for a particular reference. Building on this, there have even been attempts to teach dolphins an even more elaborate language-like communication system. The most extensive investigation was done by Louis Herman, who conducted systematic tests of bottlenose dolphins at the University of Hawaii for over 3 decades. Herman's 2 most famous dolphins were Phoenix and Ake. Phoenix was exposed to an artificial tonal language that was transmitted by a computer through speakers broadcasting underwater. Not only was Phoenix able to learn an impressive number of tonal words, she could also understand basic syntactic distinctions. For example, she could differentiate between take the ball to the hoop and take the hoop to the ball. Phoenix's comrade, Ake, was just as impressive. Unlike Phoenix, Ake was trained to respond to videos of hand gesture commands with underwater button presses. In case you're wondering, dolphins press buttons with their noses. Perhaps Ake's most striking linguistic feat was to correctly respond to questions about remembering objects that were not physically present. In one experiment, when asked if a hoop was or was not located in a different tank that Ake could not currently see, she was able to answer correctly over 90% of the time. This is one of the few examples of displacement in non-human communication. Honeybees are one of the other examples. Most other communication among animals focuses on the here and now and involves things that are directly relevant to the communicator, such as immediate threats, sexual goals, location of food, or requests for actions. The fact that Ake could break free from the current situation suggests a very sophisticated form of thinking. Dolphins are impressive, but the biggest scientific bet for teaching language to animals comes from the work on primates. Primates are humans' closest relatives, so it's natural for researchers to put their hopes on our hairy cousins. Much of the modern work on teaching language to primates can be traced back to a paper written in 1909 by the American psychologist Lightner Witmer. Although Witmer is best known for founding the field of clinical psychology, he inspired a century of research on primate language with his paper entitled A Monkey with a Mind. The paper focused on Peter, who, despite the title, was actually a 3-year-old captive chimpanzee. Peter had been impressing audiences in the vaudeville circuit for his remarkable human-like behaviors: wearing clothes, eating with a fork and knife, smoking cigarettes, skating on roller skates. I think you get the picture. Witmer was so intrigued by Peter that he asked his trainer if he could do some scientific tests on Peter's cognitive abilities. Peter passed many of the tests Witmer threw at him, but Peter's language skills were not quite as impressive. Granted, Peter could understand basic commands such as give mom a drink or hit dada, and he could even utter the word mama. But as a clinical psychologist with expertise in child development, Witmer wondered whether Peter could have learned so much more had he been exposed to language at a younger age. This simple question set the stage for language training studies on primates for the next 100 years. Many of the early attempts to test this hypothesis took an extreme approach. Researchers adopted baby chimps and tried to raise them as human children. One of the most famous cases involved the psychologist couple of Luella and Winthrop Kellogg. In 1931, the Kellogg's adopted a 7.5-month-old female chimp, Gua, and raised her alongside their own biological child, Donald. Although Gua was ahead of her brother at 1 year of age in producing words and understanding basic commands, Donald quickly overtook his sister at 18 months and never looked back. It became clear to the Kellogg's that Gua would never catch up, and the experiment ended uncomfortably with Donald starting to imitate Gua's vocalizations. This prompted the Kellogg's to return Gua to the research center where she was originally adopted. These sorts of experiments went on for decades, including one with a chimp named Nim Chimpsky, a not-so-subtle play on Noam Chomsky, who famously argues that language is innate only to humans. But in the late 1960s, researchers took a new approach to immersing primates in language. Influenced by research showing that sign language shared all the basic universals of spoken language, researchers moved away from vocal training to training of hand gestures or signs. One of the most famous cases is Washoe. Washoe was studied by another husband-wife psychologist pair, Alan and Beatrix Gardner. Adopted as a 2-year-old, Washoe was taught American Sign Language as her exclusive form of communication. Washoe eventually learned over 350 novel ASL signs. She could understand and produce sign strings, and in some cases, she could communicate about things in the non-here and now. And perhaps the most famous example, one of Washoe's trainers greeted Washoe after taking a long maternity leave. Sadly, the trainer had experienced a miscarriage while away, and the account goes that the trainer signed to Washoe that her baby had died. Washoe was said to have forlornly looked down at the trainer's abdomen and then, looking up, made the ASL sign for cry. We'll come back to this. In addition to anecdotes, there are many published accounts of Washoe's impressive use of signs. For example, one paper reported that Washoe was taught to brush her teeth after meals and before bed, and at some point she acquired the sign for toothbrush. Eventually, she got into the habit of making a toothbrush sign after she finished dinner every night. This suggests that Washoe could communicate about things in the non-here and now, and is further support that humans are not the only ones to use displacement when communicating. I should add that there are other well-known examples of language learning in primates, such as Kanzi the bonobo and Koko the gorilla. I encourage you to read up on these, but in the interest of time, it's necessary to point out some of the major challenges to this whole line of work. I'll briefly address two of the biggest critiques. First, many scientists have argued that there is a high degree of rich interpretation of the data. Language training studies require an immense amount of time. Time, energy, resources is just a huge investment, and this makes it hard for the researchers to see things objectively. Now, some studies are better than others in this regard. For example, Washoe had a very strict definition of what actions were and were not actual signs. Still, interpreting what a sign means in context is highly subjective. Take the baby example. When Washoe glanced down at her trainer's abdomen and gestured, "Cry," was Washoe really communicating her sadness about her handler's baby? Or was she communicating that her handler looked sad? Or Washoe saying that she was sad not to have seen her handler for so long? It's very hard to differentiate among these possibilities, especially when one of the meanings is so touching. Examples like this are rife in language training studies. A second related critique concerns the nature of what is actually learned by the animals in these studies. Are primates, dogs, and dolphins really learning to communicate like humans, or are they just learning to produce complex behaviors in response to various cues? Much of human communication is spontaneous and unsolicited. Think of all the advice you have never asked for. Plus, the topics of language are totally unconstrained. Things feel very different with language-trained animals. The vast majority of their utterances fall into two categories. They are either solicited by humans, such as responses to questions or commands, or they are solicitations of a human, such as requests for food, objects, or actions. Relatively speaking, there are very few utterances that would qualify as basic chit-chatting. This suggests that humans and non-humans have quite different social goals when communicating. So putting it all together, let's first talk about the similarities between humans and non-humans. Thinking back to our last lecture on linguistic universals, what are some of Hackett's basic design features of language that we share with other animals? As we've seen, one of the most promising similarities is the possible use of symbols. Although the level of sophistication is still debatable, in the most basic sense, animals seem cognitively equipped to map meaning onto arbitrary symbols, be it alarm calls, spoken words, or hand gestures. This suggests that humans are not the only ones with the cognitive capacity to